Hey, welcome everybody to the Sacramental Charismatic. I am Luke Garrity, your host, and I am a pastor theologian in Northern California. And I feel like this year, 2021, has been a somewhat productive year because I have been able to record and put out some podcasts on a somewhat regular basis. That's my goal for this year, or for this season, I should say, and for all seasons in the future, is to keep on putting out podcasts with really great guests. And I'm getting into the rhythm, so it feels really, really good. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know it's an intersection of a variety of different subjects. We talk about pneumatology, ecclesiology, missiology, and sacramentality, but we also talk about whatever comes up, and I've had some great guests. And so if you are new to the podcast today, you should check out the catalog of episodes that has come out. Today, I'm really, really pleased to have a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who we've been hoping to do a podcast for a while. He has a day job, though, so I'm always constantly having to figure out when I can get him on this podcast. And he also has been dodging me a little bit, but I'm going to have him on this podcast today. We're going to get him to share why he's been dodging, but I'm super pleased to have Ramon Mayo. We are super pumped to have you on this podcast, Ramon.
What's up, Luke?
Why you been dodging me, bro?
I haven't been dodging you. I gotta go to work. I can't be like just taking breaks doing podcasts.
I feel like you could. You work from home now. I mean, you're in Chicago. Feels like you can do that. No, you have a job that monitors your output.
Well, I'm the monitorer.
Oh, that's even worse.
That would be a bad example.
That would be like, hey, our manager is doing podcasts all the time. What's up with that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, man, I'm super grateful for you taking the time to be a part of it. And I know we're going to get into some fun conversation today, but I just wanted to say we've known each other for what, 7 or 8 years, something like that.
It's been about 7 years. I know since I've been in Chicago. So yeah. That's been 7 years.
And you have been a church planner. You are also in the Vineyard movement, the tradition that I'm a part of. You've been a youth pastor. You have been a associate pastor. What are all the things that you've done? I mean, you've done.
Well, I was a part of a church plant. I wouldn't call myself a church planner.
You're a church planner. No, in the Vineyard, that's exactly what you do. If you were a part of a church plant, then you tell people you're a church planner. I have multiple people that I've seen.
No, I didn't have that much skin in the game. So.
Did you go? Were you there? Did you set up?
Yeah.
Okay, church planner.
Anyway,
it's on your resume.
So yeah, I was a part of a church plant in SoCal. Became associate pastor there. Then took over as the lead pastor. That church was a multi-ethnic church, and I love that church because we're a multi-ethnic church. That's one thing we got right. All the other stuff about church, we didn't get quite so right. So we had to shut that thing down. And then moving out here to Chicago, I got a job as an editor for an African-American Christian publisher. And so I've been doing that for about 7 years. And then I've been here at the South Suburban Vineyard with Gino Allison and doing just a variety of things. But for the last few years, I've been really focused on youth ministry.
Awesome. And your wife and you have 3 kids?
Yep.
Yeah. And I've seen your kids, and they're probably some of the cutest kids in the universe.
Not for me.
Yeah. I was going to say your
no
wife.
Credit.
Yeah. And so you've been involved in a lot of different areas of I think in the region out there. I've actually preached at your church. Were you? I don't know if you were there when I was there. I preached at your church one time though.
Mm-hmm. I was there, but I actually was that in the room? Yeah, I was in the room.
I feel like you had to go do youth ministry or kids church or something like that. Yeah. But anyway, the church community you're a part of is amazing. Gino and the team there have done a really great job. I think we've been talking about doing a podcast for a while, and you have just written a book that's going to come out in about a week and a half. Correct?
Yeah, February 10th is the launch date.
Hey, that's my birthday, dude. So
well, maybe I can give you a copy.
I don't want you to give me a copy. I'm going to buy 10 copies for myself because I can. Yeah. So we were talking about doing this, but I thought you had a great idea. And I've checked out your book. I got the sample chapter. I want to talk about your book in a little while too. But what I thought was a really great idea is you said, hey, why don't you have me on for Black History Month? And so for anybody listening, February is Black History Month, and it's I thought a great idea, and I was thinking more about it, and I thought, hey, I'm going to just have all Black voices and Black people on for the entire month of February, because I think that there's a lot of people that I know that I'd love to have on, and this might be a good time to try to give them. Like I was like, okay, I'll ask them to be on for Black History Month, and they can't say no. It's Black History Month, and they're Black, and I'm white, and so so far it's been working. But I love that idea about this month being kind of dedicated to exploring different voices and perspectives in the church that from our Black brothers and sisters. And I just really am so grateful for you for even just suggesting that as an idea, because it seems to be really it's just working out really well with some of the conversations I wanted to have. So thank you for that. But it also goes to the topic of your book a bit too, which we're going to get to. So for our listeners, though, who may be new to the idea of Black History Month, or maybe that's something they see on TV, but they don't really understand why it's important or the history of it. Would you take a few minutes here and just flesh out why Black History Month exists, why it matters, and help us understand why this is such an important thing to celebrate and to participate in?
Well, I mean, just from the historical level, is Black History Month was started by a guy named Carter G. Woodson, who was a historian, a Black historian. And so he basically wanted to take a month to highlight the accomplishments and the leaders and the great people within Black history, within America's Black history. And so it's important to me, and I think it's important for all of us as Americans to acknowledge the contribution that Black people have made to the country. You think about America wouldn't be America without African Americans. I mean, in some ways, if you think about the things that we value and the things that the world values about America, a lot of it is because of African Americans. And you think about, what's American music? It's jazz, it's rock and roll, it's hip hop. Those are Black contributions. When you think about just the culture and the cultural exports of America, you think African American contributions. And so it's something that we don't really think about, how much African American culture and African American contributions contributed to the making of America and the success. If you think about the worldly, prosperity success of America,
economically.
Exactly. This country was built on the back of slaves. And so not only that, but then you got to think about the folks who were free, and after, post-slavery, people who were inventing things that we don't really, we take it for granted, like the traffic light. Mm-hmm. That was invented by a Black man, Garrett Morgan. So those things, they don't get the attention throughout the year. And it should be that it's Black history should just be in American history. It should be interwoven throughout, but it's not. And so we highlight, Black contributions in the month of February, and that's where we get, Black History Month. I think for the Christian, it's even more of an imperative to honor and appreciate Black contributions, especially when you think about the Christian contribution to America as far as the African American Christian contribution. Mm-hmm. We talk about the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, nobody ever talks about the Third Great Awakening, post-Civil War. One of the biggest, largest church planting, if you want to talk about a church planting movement, that was throughout the South. Once slaves were free, they were building churches. That was like one of the biggest revival times in the course of American history, from I think that was 1865 all the way to like 1900.
Yeah,
and, so,
and largely it doesn't feature in a lot of church history books.
No, you don't.
Yeah,
you don't see that. You would see it in Carter G. Woodson's book, History of the Negro Church. Du Bois talks about it in Souls of Black Folk, but you don't see. I mean, I haven't seen a book a recent book that really highlights that.
Yeah. Yeah. So is that I was thinking about how like a lot of I can't speak to school history classes now because it's been decades since I've been in high school. But it seemed like when I was a kid, there were a few little highlights. Washington Carver got a big shout out, and it was always because of peanut butter, which I think he actually didn't even invent peanut butter. He just invented like all these other things to do with peanut. So like peanut butter probably wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Washington Carver. But it's fascinating though, because there wasn't a lot of emphasis on African Americans in history. And I love what you're talking about, how there's been so many different significant contributions over the course of our history that it's really sad that we don't have more space for that. So the history behind it is to expose the wider American, I guess, public, people to the contribution of a significant portion of our population, to like say, hey, not only are they here, but they've also been participating and contributing for a very long time.
Yes, and it's a hidden history. We think about like you said, George Washington Carver, nod to Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass.
Yeah,
but there's so many different things that people don't know about the history of Black people in America, Black folks in America. I mean, Central Park, the area of Central Park used to be a Black town or a Black neighborhood in New York. Most people don't know that. Tulsa, there was an area in Tulsa called Black Wall Street that was, there was a massacre, it was a riot, the whole thing got burned down, but it was a city that was filled with, I won't say filled, but there were a lot of millionaires in Tulsa at the time. So that, that kind of stuff gets played down, or at least it's hidden. People don't really talk about it.
It seems like I had not heard of Black Wall Street until this previous summer, when our country seemed to have a national, or it calls it a national reckoning. I don't know if that's necessarily the best term myself, but there was definitely at the forefront of society that there were these. This was not new to the world, to our country. The situations and the terrible experiences of African Americans has been happening since day one, before we were even a country, right? But yeah, the Black Wall Street story is, I don't know what words to use other than it's absolutely terrible, and it's tragic, and it's, just grieving, to read. So let me ask you this then, for you, like, what would be the best introduction for someone like myself who, I love reading, I love history. Like, if I wanted to get, a really good history of African Americans what's one book, or what are a couple books that you'd say, hey, you need to check out that book? And we'll leave a description in the description area of each book, a link to it.
So I think there's so many to choose from, but if you're talking about like an introduction, probably Before the Mayflower.
Okay.
By Lerone Bennett, that's his name. And I think the latest edition goes up to like the 90s, but I could be wrong. It could be even more revised now. I haven't looked at it in a while. Like my copy is from the 90s.
Okay.
But yeah, Lerone Bennett goes all the way from Egypt to West Africa, to slavery, to, I mean, he goes to Jamestown, to the Civil War, to Reconstruction. I mean, the whole gamut. So it's a really, really good book.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so we'll leave a link in the description for that book for anybody who's interested in learning more about African American history. And this would be a great month to pick up a copy of that book, as well as any
Yeah.
other books that might be out there. No, that really is, I think, helpful. So let me ask you this. Let me play the devil's advocate just for a moment, just to I think flesh this out.
Not the devil's advocate.
Not really the devil, but like, when I've heard people, think about Black History Month or any month, like March is Women's Month, and I'm thinking about trying to make the commitment of having only women speak on the podcast for March. Because I've been reaching out to a number of women who are biblical scholars and theologians. I think that'd be really fun to do. But I've heard several people in the course of my life say things like, well, we shouldn't just focus on one group of people at one time, because, a lot of people have done things and we don't talk about them, or, whatever. And maybe you've even heard other dumb, sorry, I let my play my cards. Other people say other things that would almost be dismissive to the value and the importance of a specific time a month to talk about, the contributions of one group of people, or, what would you say to that? What would be your primary way of, because you're a nice guy, like you wouldn't punch him. I would probably just punch people. I feel like you might be helpful in this area.
I think that just shows a lack of awareness of history. Like it shows a lack of awareness of a broader view of history and a broader view of the historical oppression of different groups. Mm. And so, it's like that whole argument of if you do this for Black people, then that's racism against white people. And it's not. We're trying to, to promote one group at a certain time for a specific purpose is not down in the other groups. It's focusing on that one group. It's just like, if I had a kid, I have 3 kids, but with your kids, one of them has a birthday, you're celebrating their birthday. You're not down in the other ones.
Yeah.
Their birthday is coming, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's very sensitive for people to think that. Like, I think it speaks to a sensitivity and I think when you've been on top, and I speak to, being on top as far as the majority culture, the majority white culture, when you've been on top to promote, another ethnicity, it becomes like a threat. So anybody who speaks that, in some way you feel threatened.
Yeah. So like, that's the place of like, it's really easy, I think, for people who have been, you're using the word power or having the influence of the majority, but like privilege would be another word that's been, used quite a bit in the last, it's been used for a long time. In the last year, it feels like people are actually like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that as much, but yeah, it's like really dismissive and easy when you have had lots of focus on your history to tell other people to not really worry about it or not celebrate it. So let me just flesh that out a little bit more. And I want to be an advocate for that, because I do think that, like reading your book, I reread the chapter again today, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read the rest of the book because of all the different theologians you're going to cover, which we'll talk about in a minute, because they're some of my favorites. But, like the feeling that you're talking about of dismissal, like when somebody tells you to not celebrate your own heritage or your own ethnicity, like I can't imagine a white person being okay with that. Like, if you said to them, hey, you shouldn't celebrate your Italian heritage, don't eat Italian food, or like, that seems crazy,
Yeah.
Flesh that out for me. Like, it just feels dismissive. What are some other feelings?
I think, and this is something I don't want to say that everybody feels threatened, because you can come at a subject out of pure ignorance. Like I've had conversations even with people of other ethnicities, my Asian brothers and sisters, and I've been, put in check and corrected. So I don't speak to people's like motives. But a lot of times it is like a sense of being threatened, but other times it's a sense of just not understanding, like a true, like, hey, I don't understand. But that lack of awareness just speaks to the fact that, we haven't celebrated the history of African Americans or any other group, because you wouldn't even question it. It's like, what I said about, American history, we don't really highlight stuff, and you think that's all there is. And so the reason why we even promote Black History Month, or even a Women's History Month, or Asian American History Month, all of that is because it's hidden. It's not in the textbooks. It's not spoken about. There's not that many movies about it. It's just not there. Like, I was privileged, like where I grew up, we had it, like, because we were, majority African American and Mexican, we really promoted that. At least the school district did, for us. But I know in other districts and other places that wasn't being talked about. And we had a lot of African American teachers who, we had our set curriculum, and then they would kind of take us aside, like, okay, here's this other curriculum.
Here's some stuff you need to know about your past.
Exactly.
And not just your past, but how your past has been impacted by the pasts of other people in our country, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I wonder if, sometimes it feels like there's a I think that you're right. It's hard to know the motives behind a lot of people and how their ignorance fleshes out. Because I was just thinking about that, talking to a friend today about how sometimes the outcome is really bad, but the motivation actually may not be as bad as it sounds, but there's like a fear of, we talk about reckoning, that's a lot of conversations I've had with friends, people of color have been talking about a national reckoning for the atrocities of the past. And I'm still like, I don't know what reckoning looks like or means. I know the church's response should be definitely wrapped up in repentance and should be in humility for sure. But I still like, how do we reconcile in, this past? But it seems like there's some people who are just like, almost, it's like they don't want to really go down that road, because to be confronted with the reality of it is almost unbearable. Which is again, another place of privilege, though, to be able to say that. It's like, well, I don't want to have to deal with the emotional toil of having to know what happened during slavery or Jim Crow law. Whereas every Black person I know is very familiar with every single one of those situations and has had to live through the toil of that. Do you think that's a fairly common reason why a lot of, or maybe some people would be really hesitant to dive into exploring more of the bad parts of our history?
Yeah, there's so many reasons. I feel like I always say, like, if somebody says something that seems racist, I try to like caution people, like, they really could be racist and just hateful. They could be selfish and not really thinking about you. And they want what they want, and if they give in to whatever you're wanting them to give in to, then they lose something, or they could just be dumb.
This is why I like you a lot. Yeah,
or all three. It's we can't assign motives. We can't assign like that. That's not up to us. I feel like that's something that I want to steer the conversation away from. Because a lot of the conversation that I've been seeing, like on Twitter or just in the media, it's like everything somebody says, if it's not politically correct, is racist. And it's like, that's not how this works. Like, racist or dumb.
That's kind of the it's interesting, because I like trying to navigate the political environment right now is really challenging for followers of Jesus. Like, it's just challenging, and because there's the ideologies that are trying to vie for complete allegiance. And I think followers of Jesus, as you and I have talked about before, it's like we're like unable to. It's like
Exactly.
sometimes I'm over here and sometimes I'm over here, and it's going to be based off of the specific issue, and it might be a little bit more complicated and complex and nuanced. But one thing that seems like it's really common now is that to throw the racism card out on everything is, and then go into this cancel culture concept where everybody's getting canceled on it, which is something I've had numerous people talk about lately with me. It's like, man, I want to acknowledge that racism is real, though. I mean, I have seen,
Yeah,
my wife
definitely.
and I have not experienced it obviously in the same manner that a lot of other people have, but we've seen a lot of it in the last few years, more so than probably most of my life. And it's kind of hard because, like, I want to be able to just say, hey, that's race. You're racist. That's a racist perspective. And I found telling somebody that are racist doesn't work nearly as well as when I say, hey, let me unpack for you why that perspective is actually rooted in an ideology that is actually racist. Like, you might not
Yeah,
intend it to be, but like,
exactly.
it is.
Exactly.
And I think that's why I really have appreciated our friendship, because I feel like you have just been really helpful for me to think about things in a manner that's moving towards reconciliation and moving toward better understanding of people, and like trying to just be aware. Like, I love that you're talking about that from that perspective. So you can't assign motives, but some people are dumb. That's what I got.
You can't assign motives, and I feel like when people are like that whole phrase, that approach that you said, hey, I don't want to feel this, this reckoning, this emotional toil, that is a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't do that. I can't say I don't want to feel this. Like, I feel it all the time. Um, I was on another podcast. I think it was the Vineyard Justice podcast. I was saying, hey, when I drive through West Virginia or Western Pennsylvania or Southeastern Ohio, what's up, Vineyard friends in those places?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm scared if I'm driving at night. Because that's they did a Twitter study, where they found the most N words that were dropped were from people in those areas. And so they named it Racist Row.
Wow.
And so if I'm driving to my mother-in-law in Pittsburgh area, and I'm driving through southeastern Ohio or through West Virginia or even Western Pennsylvania going there, and it's nighttime, it's like, hey, we need to get to where we need to get.
Yeah.
And it may be irrational, right? But I saw the data.
Yeah, I
Before
feel
I
like
saw the data, I was upset. I
feel like that's not irrational at all. I think that that's really reasonable. I was surprised. I had shared a story, one of many stories I could share about how when I was touring back in the underground battle rap days, and I was touring with just all people of color. I was the only white dude, and three of my black friends were on tour with me, and then a Latino. And I kid you not, every time we went through a small town, we got pulled over. It was like, I mean, we just expected it, and we would pull over, and I didn't have any no searching of my thing. It was always, the black dudes who basically had to get all their stuff out, and we'd sit there. And I remember one time, I got really upset, and I should have been upset for other reasons because it happened so consistent. But I got really upset because one of my record crates holding all my 12 inches, like, one of the cops took it and threw it on the ground and just spilled it all over. And I was like, "This is wrong!" Never mind the fact that it had been happening to my friends for literally their whole entire lives. And I was surprised, and that was 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago when it happened. But a person told me, well, you can't bring that up now because that happened so long ago and it doesn't happen anymore today. And I was like, I don't know. All my black friends now tell me that happens all the time where they live. So it's probably true. It seems like it's true in some cases. Our society has made progress, but there's still a lot of places in the US that have not made progress. And there's still a lot of people who have a really bad way of looking at people, and so, yeah, I think that it would make perfect sense why, there's people out there who feel, like they have to be really careful in certain places.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, in Compton and Linwood, and we had, there was a sheriff's gang, right? You don't normally think of sheriffs forming a gang. Supposed to be them chasing after the gangs, but they formed a gang called the Linwood Vikings. And the Linwood Vikings, of course, I think they were all white, but they would harass African Americans, especially young African American males. And so that's
like they would, gang members would be their thing, right? We're just gonna harass anybody who looks like our profile
who looks like a gang member. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's what my most of my friends, being in the hip hop world, everybody dressed in urban clothing or urban gear, which I loved reading your chapter about cross colors. I was like, I remember cross colors. I remember, but Carl can I? Like it seems like that. Yeah, like that's a real reality though for a lot of people, and it doesn't mean that all. That's the crazy thing that I've tried to explain to people. I'm like, it doesn't mean that all cops are bad. In fact, most of my friends that are living in urban settings want to have more police officers who are better trained, who are doing their best to stop bad guys. Like they're not at all saying get rid of the cops or anything. They want the bad stuff to happen to no longer happen in their communities. And that's the polarization though that seems to be happening, where it's like if you say, hey, there are bad cops and bad cops should be prosecuted and they should do things to to be able to remove them, it seems like there's people who jump to the conclusion that you're saying that all cops are bad, and it's like, no, I very specific language here.
One of the things we need for this day and age, this season we're in, is the ability to look at nuance and complex issues that are multifaceted. I mean, you talk about something like police brutality, that's multifaceted.
Yeah, that's right.
You do have a crime element in a lot of these areas, which, I mean, it's justifiable for anybody who's patrolling that area to be on guard and to be scared. But then you also have bias from the police officers. It's like, where'd you get that bias from? And should you be patrolling the streets with that kind of bias? So there's just all kinds of, there's different angles to it. And you can't, it's like what you said, like you can't say like all cops are bad, but you can't say,
that's what's fascinating about this past summer. And, like I like to think of, there's that proverbial, like the most woke guy in the room is the white dude who's, 25. And I like, that seems so funny to say, but it's kind of true. Like, right. And I was talking to a friend and he is in that kind of like that category would be the best way to explain it. And I was telling him, I was like, dude, I'm with you. I think police brutality exists. I think there are systemic injustices in our system. I don't think all police officers are evil. And I think that you have to reconcile, what do you do with the vast amounts of Christian police officers out there who actually are trying to make a difference? And as he was telling me that all cops are racist, I was like, well, what about all the black officers and the Latino officers and the Asian officers?
I was just going to say, my god brother's been a sheriff, like LA County sheriff, and he's black.
Yeah, I remember. Do you remember Gospel Gangsters? Okay, so Solo, R.I.P., passed away last year, which was so for those of you who are listening, who are not into the Christian rap game, Gospel Gangsters, name might be a little cheesy, but when they came out, they were the first, like, for real, like, they were good,
They were like praising the Lord, walking, man.
But they were like good MCs. They could rap really well. They had good beats. They weren't cheesy Christian rappers. They were ex gangbangers though, like for real. But I remember on their album, I re-listened to it when I was driving down to Pasadena in last July, and I was listening to it because I was sharing it with my daughters. I was like, because we were talking about racism and just all the stuff that had happened due to George Floyd's murder. And there's a part on their first album, Gang Affiliated, where they talk about not all cops are bad, and they recommended I think it's like Cops for Christ, the organization, but they also have a whole song about police brutality from their experience of being in the hood, living in South Central. And yeah, it's I think the nuance thing is a real important point, though, because if we don't have nuance, we can't appreciate Black History Month. If we don't have nuance, we can't appreciate Asian American History Month.
Hey, if you don't have nuance, you can't love people.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Because, the only universal is Jesus, right? That's the only, we can always say Jesus is Lord, but we can't always say this particular kind of person is this particular kind of way, because people are too complex for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why there were some slaves back in the day who were close to the slave master, and others who were out in the field, and others who would run away, because there's nuance to people. People do things for different reasons, for different motives. People have different personalities. I mean, that's just the way of life. You take one family and you got, 5, 6, 7 personalities who would react in a different way depending on the situation. And that's just one family. You multiply that by I think it's how many people on the earth? 8 billion people. Yeah. You can't categorize this group of people as they are all racist. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think that's true. Which is hard right now because certain people in political parties, it seems really easy to to say, hey, that whole entire. But I've been saying that too because I think with the political spectrum, this is kind of it is on topic. Right now it's I'm trying to man, what am I? How do I define myself? Because man, these extremes are crazy to me. The extreme left is off its rocker and the extreme right is off its rocker. They're both the same thing, only the other, the other extremes. And I was talking to somebody who was basically telling me anybody who votes for Trump is a racist. And I was like, hey, listen, I think that it's one thing to acknowledge that the policies here are racist, or some of the issues that, or even he as a candidate has said racist things. But I think there's a lot of people out there that, whether you agree with them or not, I don't think that they're motivated by racism in their voting block. And so if you really want to have a conversation to be able to understand them, you can't start with that. It's like the same thing as saying anybody who votes Democrat is a baby killer.
That's not how that works. Yeah.
It's more nuanced than that. But we don't in society, it seems like we don't like nuance. We want to be able to make it easy and just dismiss everybody who's not like us.
Exactly. We don't like nuance. We don't like moderation. It's easier to just jump on a bandwagon and be extreme. It's harder to stand back and say, hey, wait a minute. I know my tribe is voting this one way, but can I critique my tribe?
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to do.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you feel at times, but it feels really lonely. It feels like, man, I can't get down with either, or, with some of these perspectives. It just feels like for me, my allegiance to Jesus and the kingdom make it really, really hard for me to go one particular way, because I want to say I'm pro-life while also thinking that putting babies in cages is bad and racism is real and we need to stand, it's like all the, it's crazy, dude. It's crazy.
It feels lonely, right? Because the extremes are always the loudest.
That's exactly it. But I don't think that they are the majority, though.
Exactly. The majority of America, the majority of Americans are in that moderate group.
Yeah.
They're not the loudest. They're not on social media because
I hope this is true.
What'd you say?
I should say, at least I hope this is true, that they're not the majority.
Well, they're not. I can safely say that. I don't have the data, but I can safely say that, because to be in the extreme group, it's so extreme that you have to promote it, right? Yeah. You have to convince people and persuade people because it's so crazy.
And it's so effective too, Ramon. I don't know if you notice it. Like people get converted all the time on Facebook with all of those posts from political parties. I mean, it's so effective. I totally understand why people
Yeah,
continue to share over and
I'm
over and over.
jumping on the bandwagon, man. I gotta get my memes out there.
It's just ridiculous, man. I really appreciate your thought. I want to talk about your book. But before we do, is there anything else that you think would be helpful for our listeners in relation to Black History Month, or even just in relation to ethnic diversity, and how you feel like the church is in need of maybe a prophetic critique or a prophetic call? Which maybe we'll get into this when we talk about your book, because your book kind of is that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that and this is kind of segue to my book, but one of the things that we have to remember is, for how long has colonialism been around? 400, 500 years. That whole project of European colonialism segue into, American slavery. It was a propaganda project.
Yeah.
It was a propaganda project. How can you take humans and make them beasts of burden? You gotta dehumanize them. And the best way to dehumanize them is to tell a whole different story about them. So that narrative, there's been a narrative that's been crafted that basically has said Black people, and not just Black people, right? There's like a hierarchy. Black people, Asian people, anybody that's non-white will dehumanize you by saying that you're dumb, you're sneaky, whatever bad characterizations we can give you. You're sneaky, you're dumb, you're hypersexual, like all of these different things. And you see it and you don't notice it, right? But it's all over the media we consume.
It's ingrained. It's ingrained in the system.
It's ingrained. Exactly. It's ingrained and you don't notice it. And that's what people talk about. A lot of times, like you'll hear the term white supremacy. And it doesn't mean like, the KKK marching through the neighborhood all the time. Like it means when you think about a certain person in history and your imagination sees them as white, but the facts say they weren't from Europe.
Yeah.
Like that's the work of white supremacy.
Yeah. And it's such a prevalent thing in history, because it's been, like the whole concept of whitewashing history is true. It's happened. Yeah. So let's talk about your book, because I think, what you're saying is obviously a big part of your book, and the kind of the putting it together. So let's talk about that, and let's kind of flesh out. I wrote down some notes based off of, you like, hey, check out my book. Here's a chapter. You don't get to read the whole thing. And then I was like, I want to read the whole thing. And
I gave you the whole thing.
Nah, did you really? Are you for real right now? Because I only have chapter 1 and it's an introduction.
No, like
I might have gotten another email that I didn't get then.
Like 2 months ago, I gave you the whole thing.
You need to let everybody know that watches this and listens to this podcast. I'm not good at email, man. I hate email. It's the worst. You ever notice I text?
I'm supposed to give you a big, huge attachment. Like
I'm a texter. Can you text it? I don't know. If you text it to me,
word file like that, bro.
Well, what you're getting right now is we're going to talk about your book based off of the table of contents and the first chapter. But because I really cannot wait to read your book, and I've been looking forward to it forever. And I mean, because you've been talking about writing this book for a while. So name of the book, title of the book, and why did you go with that title? Because I know you had a number of titles that you were contemplating.
So name of the book is Reclaiming Diversity. I went with the title because I feel like we think of diversity as this new thing, the hot buzzword. Everybody's, hey, we need to be multi-ethnic churches. It's the in thing, the fad.
Yeah.
But
it's cool to be multi-ethnic right now. Very cool.
It's cool, right? It's cool. You can get in a Gap commercial.
If they're even open anymore, I don't even know if they're open anymore. COVID world.
I'm sure they've pivoted to online.
I think they have, but I mean, do people buy Gap stuff anymore?
I don't know. I don't shop anyway.
I shop exclusively at Wu-Tang Wear, so I wouldn't know either. But yeah, shout out to Wu-Tang. Shout out to Method Man.
Diversity is like the cool thing, and I was like, you know what? It's the cool thing right now, but it's always been God's cool thing. And so it's reclaiming the diversity that we've kind of lost, or that hidden diversity, like the hidden history of diversity of the church. And so I basically, how can I say it? I've been doing some online battling myself with a lot of people in, I'm not a troll.
No, you're not. You're not a troll. You're very thoughtful.
But people come at me. A lot of people in my network, as far as, my old community, people from back home, online, they come at me with, how could you be a part of this religion, this Christianity that's, enslaved us? And, matter of fact, it's all made up anyway. It's part of this big white supremacist conspiracy. And I'm like, you need to read a book.
Yeah.
But
you start your book talking about that, how you have this conversation with a childhood friend who's basically telling you, hey, dude, why would you be a Christian? That's a white man's religion. It's not even true. There's, hasn't done anything to empower people of color. It's really bad for Black people, is basically what your friend was telling you.
And what happened, I mean, just during that meeting, I had just finished taking a class at Fuller. I took the Black Theology class. No, it was the Reradicalization of Black Theology. And so you've heard of James Cone and, Black Theology, Black Power, Gotta Be Oppressed, all of that. But this class, the Re-Radicalization of Black Theology, really dug into taking from older sources, not Cone. And Cone took from Barth, right? He took from Barth. He took from the contemporary sources of the day.
Yeah.
But
in a sense, it's like, would it? I've only read like 2 Cone works, but it seems like it's very similar to how the Vineyard early on. We didn't have any Vineyard theologians really, right? So what we did is we borrowed from George Ladd and Wayne Grudem, was one of our guys. We just took basically, I would say we took Pentecostal and Baptist theologians and vineyardized it, left behind the things we didn't like and then added the things that we did. Was that kind of similar to your understanding of Cone's work with Bart and other?
Yeah. I mean, he had Bart, he had, some other folks, but then he combined those or juxtaposed those with a lot of, Black culture and the situation of the time. So this would be, the re-radicalization of Black theology would be, instead of going to, in Cone's case, he went to Bart. Instead of going to that, if we were in the Vineyard, we go to the original Quaker sources.
Yeah. Well, this is like what James K. Smith talks about, like drinking from your own wells.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our professor, Dr. Ralph Watkins, he took us to a lot of ancient Egyptian mythology, and said, hey, where are the parallels you see with Scripture? What things can critique Scripture? What things, from here can, what things can Scripture critique about this? So we borrow from we studied a lot of Egyptian mythology. We also studied a lot of the church fathers, just to have a greater sense of the sources we could borrow from for an authentic Black theology or authentic contextualized theology.
Mm. So what would be some of the Egyptian sources?
So the Book of the Dead, so the Egyptian Book of the Dead, what else?
So not Christian.
No, they weren't Christian sources. They weren't Christian sources. So we would look at how, how the Book of the Dead talks about, remembering ancestors and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to, things in the Bible about remembering those who have gone before you? How does that relate to, African culture, and how there's a big thing about ancestors in African culture?
Like from the missiology, just for those listening, this might be helpful too, is like to understand the colonization and how it's impacted missions. Is for a long time, missionaries would go to Africa. And I always like to remind people that Africa is a really large continent, so there's lots of parts of it.
It used to be 52 countries. I don't know how many there are now.
Yeah, many. And so they would go there, and they would see people worshiping their ancestors, and would say, "You guys stop doing that. It's bad. You should worship only God, Yahweh, Jesus. The whole 9 yards, Trinity." And I think missiologists in the last, I feel like I've read a lot about it in contemporary, like the last 20-25 years, have been realizing that actually in the African cultures where it's been talked about, it wasn't worship. It was actually just honoring their forefathers and honoring their great grandfather and their great grandmother, and it had nothing to do with like worshiping those ancestors as if they were gods in these particular countries. Because again, Africa's huge. There's lots of different locations in it. But I think that's really fascinating, because there is something unique about not just African cultures, but I think in almost every culture outside of the United States and a lot of Western societies, where there's it's really important to honor your family and to honor those who are the elderly, and those who have your namesake matters, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. So you were studying different Egyptian works that were establishing some of those things that now probably influence African culture in general.
Mm-hmm. Egyptian works, West African works. We did a lot of work with Sheikh Ante Diop.
Mm-hmm.
I forget his book. I got to get the title. It's important.
This is a book that readers need to know about.
Yeah.
If you're a reader, you need to know about it.
The African Origin of Civilization. I had to get it right.
I have actually heard of that book.
So yeah, the African Origin of Civilization, it talks about basically how a lot of the things that the Greeks brought into the world, or the Greeks, it said, hey, the Greeks did this, but Sheikh Anta Diop basically says, hey, they stole it.
They stole it, yeah.
And it's debated, right? But I think even if half of his stuff is crazy, I really feel like at least the other half will be spot on.
Yeah, well, I think there's no less information out there that has led us to believe that England or Europe was the starting of all civilization. That's definitely a narrative that a lot of people get.
And he points to like Herodotus, the histories, where it talks about how, everything came from Ethiopia, then to Egypt.
Yeah.
He talks about that. And I mentioned a lot of that in the book.
Yeah. I recorded another podcast today with my friend Edgar King, who I'll be putting this pod. So you're going to be out first, because in all celebration of Black History Month, I have to go back to my main man, Ramon, but I'm going to have him on another one, and he's a Kenyan. So I had him on for Black History Month as an true African Kenyan. And it was interesting because I was talking about how, like, hey, I have to have somebody from the motherland. You're from Africa. And it's been said many times, like, and I know in underground hip hop culture, right? Like, Africa's the motherland. It's the cradle of civilization. You hear like a lot of the 5% philosophy out there, which most of our listeners are going to have no idea what you and I are talking about. But the 5% wisdom philosophy of a lot of, hip hop culture looks at Africa as being truly the cradle of civilization. And I just read somewhere recently that that Homer's Iliad, that there's like this debate, and it was I can't remember what this essay was, but I stumbled upon it, and it's a debate now on the historicity of Homer and whether he was an actual person or it's just a collection of stories, because some of those stories have been found in other societies, not just Roman. Yeah, and it kind of goes to what you're talking about, how I don't know if there's any validity to that, as you're saying, with this other book too, but it's definitely worth considering, not just the narrative of, well, this is where it all happened and this is the only culture that's influenced society.
Yeah, and so we went through a lot of that, and my friend, he came at me saying, hey, Christianity stole this and the Greeks stole this, and I'm like, yeah, I know. So we had a big debate, and basically it came down to, I saw the gap where we agreed on some things, but we disagreed on a lot of things. Part of that is, he said, hey, if somebody, if Moses and all of these people got this stuff from Egypt, then Egypt is the true religion, because that was the first religion. And I was like, well, I know that's a logical fallacy. Just because something came first doesn't mean it's correct. So, I said, hey, we won't agree on that, but there is a gap here. And the gap was, he had no conception of early church history and the diversity, as far as ethnic diversity of early church history. And so I had been, since that time, which was it's about 9 years ago, just been digging into the church fathers, digging into Ethiopian Christianity, digging into Middle Eastern Christianity. And that's where the book came from, is, hey, the church for the first 1,000 years was super diverse. It wasn't invented in Europe. Europe was a latecomer to the game when you talk about Christian, I wouldn't say domination, but Christian popularity.
So you're wrestling with all of that in your class. You're having that conversation with your friend, and that influences and impacts you to write the book.
Yep.
Well, that was a pretty easy way to explain it. A couple of things I wanted to then talk about a little bit. And this might be for anybody who's into history and church history, especially. You asked this question and this is in your introduction. You say, why is it that today the common consensus is that Christianity is a white man's religion? If you ask most people, they will tell you Christianity came to Africa, Asia, and Latin America from Europe. And when I was reading that, I was thinking, and you're basically saying, like, that's a problem. And really, it's that Christianity came to Europe from Africa, Asia, and that essentially that's part of the challenge with the colonialization of Christianity, is that we've ignored our past, we've forgotten our past, we've changed our past, and that's really impacted us in negative ways, obviously, because it's not true, and it's important to know our history, but it's also had a negative impact on people of color.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the missiological reason why I think the truth and the history of what you're trying to raise is such an important thing, is because what you're trying to say is that it seems like, well, you actually aren't trying to, you very well say that no, Christianity has not been oppressive to people of color. White nationalistic Christianity has been oppressive to people of color. But, yes, but the history of Christianity has been deeply empowering and freeing to people of color all over the world. Is that?
Yeah, when you talk about the most religious group in America, by far is African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
We outpace every other group when it comes to prayer, when it comes to giving, when it comes to church attendance, when it comes to actually sharing the gospel. Like most people don't even think about that.
Now, and every poll reveals that too. I mean, like
Every poll
literally
reveals it.
every poll says
Every
that.
black movie reveals it.
Yeah.
There's always
For me, Denzel Washington reveals it every single time he says anything. I'm just like, dude, he is.
Who?
I was telling my wife, Denzel Washington, every time he talks, I'm like, man, this guy is the most Christian actor I've ever heard, ever. You know, I think that's right. So African American spirituality, which I bought this book. I was trying to find it the other day. But when I was in, speaking of whitewashing history, I went to Jamestown, where it all started. And when I was there, it's really fascinating because there's obviously parts of that like this is history. This is part of our history. It's just such a narrow part of the history of it, but it's really fascinating. But I went to this bookstore and I found this book about the theology, and it was the weirdest thing. It was just in a history section. It was about the theology of the African slave spirituals. And I mean, man, I like reading it. I don't think the church can talk about lament or grief without considering the songs that were being sung amongst the slaves in American history.
Well,
And it's really
when you talk about, the white nationalist Christianity oppressing slaves, one of the biggest issues in those early days was the slaves could not read the Bible. They didn't want slaves to read the Bible because once you read the Bible, you realize you have some worth.
Yeah,
you realize you're an individual. You have some kind of will. That changed the game for so many enslaved Africans. And that basically became the yearning for freedom. It's like God knows me right where I am, and He doesn't like the situation that I'm in.
Yeah, and that's what's so hard to understand, because I like the issue of like we have to be with history. When we study history, it's hard to impose our ethics and morality from today onto to them, while also still being like I don't know if you listen to propaganda, the underground, the Christian MC propaganda, but he's talking about Puritans, and he has a song about precious. Have you heard that one? Yeah, he's like, "Your precious Puritans." Yeah, and he's like, "Oh, don't you know that you can't own people?" Like it would seem so obvious.
It's a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, like you would think that, but obviously, blind spots and whatnot. But with George, well, not with George. With George Whitefield, it's fascinating that George Whitefield, he was considered a massively progressive liberal and just a little cuckoo because he preached the gospel regularly to slaves while owning slaves and having a plantation, essentially, I believe in Georgia. But it's like, it's just the incongruence, it's the inconsistency, it's the weird, like how can you own slaves and yet preach the gospel to them because you recognize they have souls? Like it's hard to grasp. But that raises the question about blind spots, I think, and that's where we have to be humble now to recognize that in our lives we have these blind spots. And so where are our blind spots? And that's what I really appreciate about your book, because you're raising that question about the blind spots we have about our own history as a people, the people of God. But you say this in the book, and this is the part that I thought was such an important thing. You said, on the home front, so here in the United States, I think, highlighting the diversity of faith will help African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans discover and own the vital truth of Christianity being a diverse religion which did not originate in Europe. And so for my listeners and viewers, I want to say a common thing that we talk about in church all the time is probably one of the most important questions somebody asks before they check out your church is, I wonder if there's going to be people like me. If we actually care about people coming to faith, it would seem that we want the answer to that question to be yes. And in some churches, we might not have a lot of African Americans or Asian people, but I think part of the way to in a sense balance that out is to tell the stories about how our faith, we might live in a community that's mostly white people. I talked to you when I was pastoring in Wisconsin, our diversity was Catholics and Lutherans. That was it, So like, how are we? I was telling Edgar today, I was like, yeah, I think Ramon, you were the one who told me, well, you can't make black people. I was like, yeah, there are no black people in my community.
Hey.
But if a black family moved into our community and we were regularly as a church talking and celebrating the fact that Christianity was diverse, that would make a huge difference about that family feeling somewhat welcome in our context, I would assume. It feels like it would be less of a challenge to be amongst all these people that they're not like, because we're saying, hey, you matter. Your ethnicity is part of our heritage. It's part of our family. Like, we love you. Welcome to our community.
Yeah. And I think, when I wrote that, I was really thinking about how there's always these doubts. If you're a person of faith, you have doubts. If you read, the Bible, if you actually read the Bible, you're going to come across some stuff that's going to make you go, And so a lot of that can hinder, it's that low hum in the back of your mind that can impede you from sharing your faith, that can impede you from praying a little harder. And so one of those doubts is this even for me? Have I been brainwashed into a white religion? And so to remove that doubt, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is there's no doubt that this is a religion that started off in Palestine and spread to all people. And the early founders of the religion, the early leaders of this religion, were from all different places on the earth. So you can be rest assured that you're not brainwashed into a European invention, a solely European invention. I don't want to dismiss the fact that, there were Europeans who helped hammer and shape the faith into what it is, but it's not their sole claim.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you flesh out quite a bit in your book, with the examples of different people who have been significantly influential in the church. In fact, I just was share this the other day with somebody, how I had a really I taught a theology course a while ago on some of the greatest influential theologians of the church. And it was my way of kind of underhandedly addressing racism in a way that I thought
underhandedly addressing race.
It was like a cheeky way to talk about it. I felt
like the racism CIA agent.
I was like, well, I just used all black theologians. That's all I talked about. So nice. I just thought, I didn't say, hey, I'm going to teach you about black people because I'm white and I probably should never say those words. But I felt like it was really cool to show people, hey, these are theologians who, if they had not done what they did, the church would be significantly different today, because they fought battles for us, that many of us are unaware of. I use the Trinity as an example, all the time. We'd be all Jehovah Witnesses if it wasn't for Athanasius as an example.
Wow.
And Augustine is, obviously one of those voices, so like the idea that it's just a bunch of white dudes sitting around with scrolls is just not true. And it was really fun. It was really fun though to do. And so your book does that. You unpack the various different people who are not white who have made a huge impact on the church, and that's really cool. So for those of you listening, you need to buy the book. Ramon, you're going to have the book out February 10th. Kindle, paper, everything.
Kindle. Kindle's first. Paper is the next week.
Okay. And then are you going to do an audio book of you reading it? Because if you haven't thought about that, you should.
I don't know about that. I'm no Morgan Freeman.
I think it'd be awesome if you did that. That'd be really a great book. Cool. Okay. So what can we do as followers of Jesus? I'm thinking about this question for this month. What can we do as followers of Jesus, just people? What can we do to better celebrate the contributions of Black people in this not just this month, but like in our lives?
I think something that you just alluded to, what you said about quoting the theologians, that's genius. So instead of always going to white sources, find the Black sources. There's plenty of them out there. You just have to look for them. And you'll find them, like I mentioned that book, Before the Mayflower. You'll find the trail of Black voices in a book like that. Black people, at least in the States, we've had our own denomination since the late 1700s, with the African Methodist Episcopal. After that, we had, the Black Baptist denominations and then the Pentecostal denominations. I grew up in the Church of God in Christ. But there's plenty of resources, plenty of wells to draw from. And so start picking some different wells to draw from. I think another thing, and I guess this goes before that, you have to find the wells. To actually read a book like Before the Mayflower or Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk or Carter G. Woodson's History of the Negro Church. Those are books that highlight, just the Christian contribution of African Americans.
Reading your chapter, I forgot Tom Oden's book.
Yes, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind.
Yeah, because that's full of lots of that's written by a white dude. I should say an old white dude who's no longer he's not alive now. But he was actually probably one of the first books I read that kind of got me leaning in that direction. And then there was I want to say it was a 1-volume commentary that featured only African theologians. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do remember that. So Oden did a multi-volume early church commentary.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's what the patristics was his thing.
But there was I know what you're talking about with that African theologian commentary.
Yeah, it was like African Bible commentary, I think. It was cool. It was a 1-volume, selection. I have it somewhere around here, but that's a great book, I think, for anybody who wants to start. And I'll have a link in the description as well for anybody else. What else? Those are you got 2 ideas. You have to be Trinitarian at least.
Really?
I don't know. I'm just going with it, man.
I think too, also just widening your circle. The reason why I ended up in the Vineyard is because I widened my circle. I didn't have to. I could have stayed in my Church of God in Christ circle. But I was at Family Christian Bookstore. They don't have those anymore.
I do remember those though.
But I was going to actually get some Christian hip hop. I was going to get the Cross Movement CD. So I picked up the Cross Movement CD, and somehow somebody left the Vineyard Breathe CD next to it. And I was like,
How unlikely.
What's this? I know, it was strange. It's like, And I remember hearing some of those songs. I don't know if it was on the radio. I just knew, I recognized that song Breathe. So I was like, let me listen to this whole album. So I picked it up and was like, man, this is some great worship. Then I started getting online, what is the Vineyard movement? Yada, yada, yada. But I found a whole stream of Christianity that I had no idea. I had no inkling that there was a Vineyard movement.
Yeah. And the Vineyard was, hi, would you like to be a part of our movement?
Actually, no.
Just checking. That's what I'm going to do if you ever come to my church. Hi, Ramon. Would you like to be a part of our church? I'll do that just to you.
But yeah, just widen your circle. Listening to Black preachers, listening to current Black theologians, folks like a lot of the work that I've done with this book. It's being taken even a step further from Vince Bantu, a professor at Fuller. He's got a book, and I actually cited his book, The Multitude of All Peoples.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great book. Dr. Antipas Harris has a book, and he just goes straight to the heart with his title, Is Christianity a White Man's Religion? His book is more comprehensive. It goes into, you know, the multi-ethnic nature of biblical characters in the church, and also just the issues that we're dealing with as a society right now as the church, as far as, you know, racism and racial justice and social justice.
Yeah.
But just widening, you know, your circle. Reading While Black is a good one from Esau Macaulay. I mean, that is fire.
It is so good. I
can't even touch my Kindle.
Dude, it's so good. I was just telling, I think I've recommended it to maybe 5 or 6 people now, and I'm like, this may be book of 2020.
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
Like, I can't even think of a better book right now, actually, for 2020. So right now, it's probably my book of 2020. Yeah, it's
so yeah, just widen your circle. You may not agree with everything these folks have to say, but at least knowing what's going on.
And can I just say, that should be assumed about every book we read, right? I mean, like, I don't know. I feel like oftentimes, like, people of color have to say, now you white people might not agree with everything, but you should just but that's true about every book. I mean, like, there's not been an N.T. Wright book that I've ever read that I've been like, I don't really buy into this part, you know. Like, I love N.T. Wright and I love a lot of what he's saying, but there's certain things about him, about his high Anglicanism, tend to, you know, it's a bias in his, I think, in his theology. But
it's about nuance, right?
Yeah.
And I think Black folks in America, and we know about nuance, right? We know that America, the Constitution is great. The Declaration of Independence is great. The Emancipation Proclamation is great, but it's not lived out, right? So do we say, well, just America's just forget it? No, we're trying to work towards a better America. We can sit back and critique while also appreciating what's good about things. And, you know, I learned that from, you know, my grandfather was a pastor, and he used to always say, you know, we would have guest preachers come, and he didn't always agree with what they would say. And he'd say, hey, chew the meat, spit out the bones. You know, and that's what you have to do with everything, right? It's you know, it's not, you know, when you get into everything this person says is the gospel, you get into what happened, you know, a few weeks ago at the Capitol.
It's true. Yeah. I've heard that phrase, chew up, you know, or spit out the bones, eat the meat, spit out the bones in the vineyard quite a bit. That seems to be, you know, like, was your grandfather a pastor in Compton?
South Central.
South Central?
Yeah.
Was he at Church of God?
What'd you say?
Was he at Church of God?
Church of God in Christ, yep.
Wow, okay. So that's kind of, did you grew up going to that church then as a kid?
Yeah. So my great grandfather on my dad's side was a bishop in the church, and then my mom's dad was a pastor, and that's all I knew. So that's how I grew up.
Yeah, it's I've been doing a lot of talking. Well, I guess I taught this course a while back. I included some church history, and there's a guy named Ben Blackwell who's in the Vineyard. You might have heard of him. He wrote a book called Engaging Theology, and he's a professor at Houston. I think Houston Baptist, but then also he is the dean or the director at the seminary there. And his chapter on the Holy Spirit, I was really happy to see that he used this very beginning. It's on William Seymour. And so it allowed me to, because of that chapter, I had assigned that chapter reading to these students I have in New Zealand. I had this huge conversation just about William Seymour's impact for our charismatic Pentecostal tradition. I mean, we would not exist if it wasn't for this blind African American preacher, you know, who I mean, what he went through is despicable. You know, I mean, he was treated so terribly by quote unquote Christians, and it's really, really important. So that's cool, man. I did not know that about your background. I knew you had a Church of God background, but I didn't know that your grandpa was a preacher. That's pretty cool. That's
yeah.
heritage, man.
What'd you say?
That's heritage. That's legacy.
I'm trying to fill those shoes.
You're doing a good job, man. I really appreciate you taking the time though to be on the podcast, and I really appreciate you just in general. I mean, knowing you has been a real blessing in my life, and I'm really thankful that you're a part of the tradition I'm a part of. But even if you weren't, I would still love you and just really appreciate your thinking, and just you really provide a lot of wisdom, I think, in a time where we need to have nuanced wisdom, as you've kind of eloquently fleshed out. So for you, those of you watching, listening, Ramon's book is coming out, and it's a great book. I really want to recommend it. I'll be buying multiple copies because I always do that for people I believe in, and I'm going to be giving.
Go to the website if you want to find out, exactly when it's dropping. Go to the website, subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get all the updates for the Kindle version, the paperback version, and I have a weekly newsletter where I just send out links where you can pick up on some nuanced wisdom.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ramon's newsletter is awesome. Every Friday I get it, and it's got 5. What do you call it? 5 stones? Is that what's called?
5 stones for Friday.
Yeah, it's great because it's like 5 really thoughtful links on just current events, theological things. It's just really, really, really great. So yeah, thank you for being a part of the podcast. For those of you who are listening, thank you so much for listening. Check out Ramon's work. Follow him on Twitter. He's on Twitter, and it's Mayotron, @Mayotron, which is pretty dang cool. Is Tron, or is it Tron?
What?
What does Tron come from? We know white people know Tron because we know a movie called
Tron. No, so back in the day, I mean, and I'm still pretty small. I was like, I used to hang with a lot of ruffians.
Yeah.
And I was like, quiet kid, church kid or whatever. And, they used to call me Mega. So it's like, he's small and tiny, but, big with the rap.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Megatron. So yeah.
I like it. And actually, maybe black people like Tron too. I don't know. Do they? Do you
black people? What? I was about to introduce my kids to Tron the other day.
Okay.
So those of us in the 80s, we looked at Tron.
I was biased scene right there. I was like, black people don't know about Tron, or they don't like Tron. Wait, they do? Okay. Yeah. Hey man, seriously, thank you. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, man. And everybody else, please again subscribe, like, follow, all the things. We'll talk to you soon. And for the rest of this month, we're gonna have a lot of great people on for Black History Month, and I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thanks, Luke. Woo!